Three friends got stuck on a chairlift, freezing to death with nobody knowing they are up there. The story begins at a New England ski resort on Mount Holliston. The friends, Dan Walker, Joe Lynch, and Dan's girlfriend Parker O'Neill, had come to the mountains for a ski trip. Dan and Joe are best friends from childhood, and they come here every year as part of a tradition. Joe usually flirts with the female ski lift operator to get cheaper tickets, but this time it's a man. So, the guys had Parker flirt with the operator to get cheaper tickets. Meanwhile, Joe is complaining about why Dan brought his girlfriend on what was supposed to be a boys-only trip. They finally got on the ski lift, and were on their way up to the mountains. Joe said Parker was smoking too much, which led to Parker immediately throwing back insults. Dan, caught in the middle, tried to calm them down. Suddenly, the lift stopped working. Parker, who was afraid of heights, was terrified, and Joe made fun of her. Eventually, the lift started working again, and they finally arrived at the top. However, it seemed they couldn't enjoy themselves because Parker was slowing them down, which only annoyed Joe further. Later that evening, back from the mountains and having dinner, Joe suggested that two of them catch the last lift to the top without Parker. She overheard this and immediately apologized for ruining their trip. Dan felt bad and asked Parker to join them, but she said she didn't even like skiing and preferred to stay in the room. Dan insisted, so the trio packed their gear and headed to the lift. Just as they arrived, the operator closed it. They began begging him to let them go one more time. The operator started laughing, saying they hadn't even paid full price the first time and that a storm was coming. They offered him $100, and he immediately accepted. The group got on the lift and looked down at people skiing. Meanwhile, the operator's colleague informed him about the work schedule for the next week. He got upset because he had told them he needed to attend his brother's wedding. He went to talk to the manager, informing him that 3 people were still on the lift. A couple of minutes later, 3 people were seen coming down, and the operator thought they were the ones his colleague had mentioned. So he turned off the lift, unaware that Dan, Joe, and Parker were still up there. At first, they thought it was just a minor inconvenience, and Joe started yelling, but everyone had already left. As night fell, the temperature dropped further, and they began discussing the worst ways to die to keep themselves entertained. Suddenly, the lights went off, causing them to panic. Now fully aware that the lift had been turned off, they started yelling for help. Parker began to freak out, saying no one knew they were up there. Dan told her to calm down and reassured her that someone would eventually come to help. Parker then remembered it was Sunday, and the ski resort wouldn't reopen until the following Friday. If no one walked by, they would be stuck there for almost a week. They tried to calm down, but fear was evident on their faces. Sometime later, Joe needed to relieve himself, so he lifted the bar to do so, leaving Parker feeling disgusted. Suddenly it starts to snow, and the storm is approaching. A few minutes later, a snowplow drives towards them, causing them to scream and yell for help. The driver stops, but only to inform his colleague that the storm is getting too strong and they should head back. The driver then begins to leave, and the group throws some of their belongings onto the vehicle, but he still drives away. Later, Parker takes off her glove to smoke a cigarette, but it falls down. Dan suggests that someone needs to jump and go for help before they freeze to death, and he volunteers to jump, thinking that the snow on the ground will protect him. Joe tries to stop him, suggesting they should wait until morning. However, Dan fears they might freeze in the cold night. Parker also expresses concern that Dan might not survive the fall, but Dan drops his snowboard on the ground and jumps immediately. Upon falling, he breaks both of his legs. Joe and Parker ask if he is okay, but Dan cannot hear them as he is in shock, staring at the bones sticking out of his legs. Parker throws her scarf to stop the bleeding, but it lands in a tree. Joe rolls up his scarf into a ball and throws it to Dan, but as Dan tries to reach it, he pushes the bone out even more. Dan asks Joe to pull himself up on a cable and go to the nearest support tower, where there should be a ladder. Joe responds that he can barely do a pull-up, but eventually agrees to help. As they begin to hear growling nearby, they realize that a pack of wolves has picked up the scent of Dan's blood. Dan panics and starts yelling for help, which only attracts the wolves further. Joe tries to climb up but quickly comes back down because the ice makes it too slippery. A wolf appears in Dan's face, and he is paralyzed with fear, unable to move a muscle. Parker throws her snowboard to scare the wolf away, but Bro returns with the whole gang. Joe holds Parker's head firmly while the wolves devour Dan. As the night deepens, everything falls completely silent. Parker blames Joe, saying he made Dan jump, while Joe defends himself, saying that he begged him not to jump. They argue and blame each other, but eventually share their grief. In the morning, Parker wakes up to find her arm frozen and stuck to a metal bar. She tries to move it, but her hand is completely frozen to the bar. She starts tearing at her skin and eventually manages to free her hand. Both of them have severe frostbite and cannot survive another night. Joe suggests he try climbing the cable to the support tower, but Parker doesn't want to risk it, and suggests they wait a few more hours in case someone is looking for them. Later, Joe falls asleep, and Parker, in tears, begins urinating herself. When Joe wakes up, he tells her how he and Dan met in elementary school. and that Dan died trying to save them, so they shouldn't waste his sacrifice. Joe climbs up the cable. As the ice melts, it's much easier now. When he steps out of the seat, a bolt holding the chair to the cable becomes dangerously loose, causing the chair to shake. But he doesn't give up, and makes it to the support tower. At the bottom, a single wolf is waiting for him. Parker throws her ski pole down, giving Joe a weapon to defend himself against the wolf. When Joe finally reaches the ground, the wolf immediately attacks him. He manages to grab the ski pole and scare the animal away. He quickly takes his snowboard and heads down the mountain, with a pack of wolves following him. Now Parker is alone. She waits for Joe for hours, and begins to fear that the wolves might have gotten to him. She survives another night, but with no sign of Joe, she starts to panic. As she moves around, the bolt holding the seat becomes even looser, and the seat falls on top of her legs. She starts to crawl down the mountain and stumbles upon a horrifying scene. Joe's scattered body parts, with a wolf nearby. Since the wolf's belly is full, it simply walks away. Parker continues to crawl until she reaches the road. Someone finally arrives, brings her to his car, and takes her to safety. And that's where the film ends. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video. Thanks for watching.